Good morning. Good to see you all. I already heard the boos come in here with. So as I mentioned last week, this was republished, but I think it was really written in the 60s. This book, The Bad Popes, and there are several of them, and here is one of them. And by the time we're done, you may be convinced, as I am, that he may just be the worst. And another book, and these are all, Albert's been linking to these when the lecture comes out, which is coming out through the Clearly Reformed website. This is the second edition. I had to get this in college. Now they're on a fourth edition, which is a little bigger and looks nicer. But Documents of the Christian Church. This is not a book that you're probably going to read straight through, but it is really helpful. I'll mention toward the very end one of the famous or infamous papal bulls, and and I'll explain what a bull is, but lots of documents from the Council of Nicaea to a papal bull to an excerpt from Anselm or Augustine. This has gone through 4 editions, and it's just really nice. You can look, and it just pulls out the most important things, and so it can be helpful instead of having to search everywhere, although now Google will do a lot of the work for you. Only 1 week left to go. Next week says John Wycliffe and John Huss. I think I'll focus mostly on Huss since he's less well known. But in order to talk about Huss, who was a Czech reformer, you have to talk about Wycliffe because he was eventually killed, spoiler alert, because he was thought to be a Wycliffite. And indeed he was. But that's where we're heading. And this morning, we are on Pope Boniface VIII and the height and depth of papal power. So let's set the stage a little bit for where we are, coming to the end of this class and sort of to the end of the Middle Ages. Though when we think of the Reformation, which is 16th century, we sometimes have in our mind, as if history just turned a page and now we're in something more like the modern world or the early modern world. And it's important to remember, even when we come to Luther, which we won't do in this series, that you're really someone who's a late medieval man, that is very much still is the world and the mindset of the medieval times, not the restaurant that you might go to. Anyone ever go to the medieval times? That's, That's a real classy place to go to. They serve you your food and then you watch like a fake jousting. It's really amazing. By the end of the Middle Ages, Western Europe was demonstrably and pervasively Christian. Now, it was sometimes, for sure, a Christianity that was a few inches rather than a few miles deep. Many ministers lamented the same things that ministers might lament today, that the people were not as Christian as they should be. They observed too many churchgoers were falling prey to worldly pleasures. They were guilty of sexual sin, Sabbath breaking, marital strife, plain old spiritual laziness. So people have always been as people are. And yet the very fact that ministers could complain that their villages and towns and cities and lands were not as Christian as they should be underscored the fact that there was a sense of ought that these were Christian people. In England, for example, by 1300, there were around 9,500 parish churches. And those were the official churches. So the parish, the lands were divided up into cities or regional areas, and there would be a parish, and there would be official parish church where you were supposed to go to. But there were, at the same time, another 20,000 to 30,000. It's just very rough estimates. So this is England, 1,300, 20,000 to 30,000 chapels, and 9,500 parish churches. Well, what's the difference? Well, a chapel could take many different forms. They could be like a private church in a castle. If you were a king or you were some other kind of nobleman or a duke or you're just very wealthy, you might have your own little church with an attendant priest and your servants and your people attended, and that would be a chapel, not an official parish church, but a chapel in some wealthy estate. You also had what were called chapels of ease, which is, just as the name suggests, when you had parish boundaries that were large and it was hard for people when you have to walk, or maybe you can come on horseback to get to your parish church, they had a number of these other smaller chapels of ease. So, wow, I got to walk 5 miles to get to my parish church, but a mile away is this little chapel, and it was, for all intents and purposes, another church, though it didn't have the official parish stamp of approval. And then there were a number of general chapels. So these could pop up all over the English landscape. Some of them might be dedicated to a particular saint, or they might be for a particular holy day, which would be open for a few times. It's All Hallows Eve, so why don't you come to our... And some of them really were sort of tourist attractions that you might come and for a donation or a fee, and it would help support the construction of some bridge or some mill, and perhaps it was reputed to have been a miracle happened here, or some famous person was here, and you would come to this little chapel. So there were maybe 20 or 30,000 of those. So you add this up with a population in England, again, it's just estimates, can't know for sure, of maybe 3 to 5 million people. These are a lot of religious buildings. And that's to say nothing of the countryside dotted with crosses and shrines and other kinds of iconography. If you could have traveled through England at the start of the 14th century, you would have easily concluded, and rightly concluded, England is a Christian land, and these are Christian people. Almost everyone would have been baptized, married, buried, christened, had a mass in a Christian building by a Christian cleric, surrounded by Christian family members and neighbors. The church stood at the metaphorical and often at the literal center of medieval life. And so it was, it was, to quote a later Englishman, it was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. Because even though Western Europe by the 14th century was pervasively Christian, at the same time, in many places, especially when the higher up you went in the church hierarchy, the church was tragically corrupt, deeply divided, desperately in need of reform. And there is perhaps no better example, or we may want to say no worse example, of all of these things, corruption, the need for reform, division, than this man, Pope Boniface VIII. If you could just, sort of in your mind have the soundtrack, bum, 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 bum. Okay, something like that for Pope Boniface VIII. His name, of course, these papal names were titles, were names that they took when they became pope, but those weren't their given names. So Benedict Gaetani. Now, don't mean to be stereotyping for Italian friends here, but some of these names sound like if you were making a mobster or mafia television show or movie, and indeed, when we get into the details, it's going to sound very much like the mob. And I remember one historian actually reflected, and I don't know if you can actually make a historical connection, but it is sort of interesting, that the Roman Empire, so way back, 1200, 1,000 years before this, that the Roman Empire did kind of function a little bit like a mafia family in this way, that when the empire came in and took over your lands, they wanted to humiliate you, but then, if you would just mind your own business and you would pay the fees or the tributes that were necessary, and if you would kind of just show loyalty to the family, then Rome would protect you. And they would make sure nobody would be ashamed if somebody found out about it. They don't want us to see. Rome would be a kind of protection. And here's one of the really unique things about the Roman Empire. Of course, Rome is a city in Italy, and then it expands to fill this massive swath of land all around the Mediterranean Sea. And one of the fascinating things is when they conquered people, I don't know how long it always took, but then they wanted to become Romans, most of them. Now, the Jews were actually an exception to this rule, but they were given certain perks to allow certain exceptions because the Jews thought of themselves as Jews first and didn't particularly like the. It's not that everyone loved the Romans, but it's amazing how many of these people, just think about what we've been studying, this Christendom constantly goes back to want to think of themselves as part of the Roman Empire, even though all these people had at one time been conquered by the Romans. But they had also been given protection, and there was something about, hey, we're on the winning team, and these people and this civilization has produced such wonders. Benedict Gaetani was born in 1235 in the ancient town of Anagni, 35 miles southeast of Rome. Benedict came from a well-off, well-connected family. Again, you see one of the themes. Almost everyone we've looked at has come from a well-connected, wealthy family. That's just part of history. The fact that they were educated often meant that they had to be from one of these families. His family had several popes among his relatives. Prior to becoming pope himself, Benedict served for 40 years in the Roman Curia. Sometimes see that word, it just means the papal administrative state, so the administrative body of the Catholic Church. He served as a priest, as a cardinal, as a foreign diplomat, because it's very important to keep in mind, by this time the papacy is a sort of world bestriding, not quite world, but Western world bestriding foreign power. So they have diplomats at different places, they have their own land holdings, as we'll see, and Benedict worked in this papal apparatus. He was a skilled tactician, an expert in the law, who understood how things were done in the unseemly underbelly of papal politics. And he made a good living doing so. He accumulated a number of benefices, which means a church position of some sort. So a benefice is some kind of church position which has an income attached to it. So it could be a very minor thing all the way up the scale, and he accumulated many benefices. And one of the complaints that is rampant during this time and will be rampant up to the Reformation is then absenteeism. So when you are given, so it's like, hey, how can I make more money? Well, I could be appointed the senior pastor at Christ Covenant, and then maybe I can be like an associate pastor at Sovereign Grace, and then I can also be at RTS. Oh wow, this is sounding bad. Not the Sovereign Grace thing, but they had these many benefices, and then they didn't do anything. So hopefully you see some difference there. So they didn't do anything. They didn't show up. They were just given all these titles and all of these incomes. And Benedict, like many people, had many of these. And he had accumulated a number of land holdings in England, France, and Italy. Benedict Gaetani served, and we might say reigned is really a better word than served, as Pope for less than 10 years. 1294 to his death in 1303. So less than 10 years, and yet everything about his pontificate, including his election as Pope, was controversial and dramatic. I don't know if this is my favorite lesson because it's someone to emulate, and yet as far as just the sheer drama and soap opera nature of it, it is fascinating. So before we can understand how Benedict became Pope, we need to go back to Pope Nicholas IV. Pope Nicholas IV died on April 4, 1292. So Benedict's going to become Pope in 1294. So in 1292, Pope Nicholas IV died, and the papacy was vacant for over 2 years as the College of Cardinals, and there were 12 cardinals at the time, so the College of Cardinals has to elect the Pope. One of the difficulties, so there were lots of troubles always with, kings and kingdoms, and lots of people fighting over that, but at least with a kingdom, there was a general awareness that this was supposed to pass then to your son. Now, that didn't stop family members from fighting and killing each other, but there was some kind of lineage. All right, my oldest son, my next son, he will, well, by definition, the Pope doesn't have any sons, or at least he's not supposed to have any sons. So you're always having this drama, especially now by the late Middle Ages. Who's going to be the next pope? Who are the cardinals going to elect? And often subterfuge is going on. There was a story that developed in this time, in the 13th century. Now later scholars proved pretty conclusively that this wasn't true, but at this time they were still believing this was true. Have you ever heard of, you can go Google it later, Pope Joan? So there was a story that developed right around this time in the 13th century that centuries previously there had been a woman who disguised herself and dressed up like a man, and for 2 years she was the Pope until, with her lover, she got pregnant. Oops! I guess this Pope John is actually Pope Joan. So there were that kind of stories, probably didn't really happen, but there were those stories developing. There's always drama around the selection of a pope. So these cardinals were divided between two powerful Italian families. And this is where it sounds a little bit like the mafia. But you have the Colonna family and the Orsini. Now, Benedict is Gaetani. He's not one of these two powerful families. But the cardinals, there's only 12 of them. One dies. There's only 11 of them. Others get sick. So when it comes to deciding, they're down to 9 cardinals. And they're split pretty evenly. In fact, some of them are from the Colonna family, and some of them are from the Orsini family. Now, the last pope, Nicholas IV, he had been an Orsini. And so the Orsini are loath to lose their power. No, we like this. One of our family members is on the throne. But the Colonna think, now wait a minute, shouldn't we be kind of swapping back and forth? You just had one of your people. I think it's time for one of our people. The position of the Roman pontiff was supposed to be a spiritual office, and it came to be perhaps the most important authority in Europe, but at another level, it was the supreme prize for rival Roman families. It was largely which Roman family is going to get this prize of the papacy. July 5, 1294. You might say, we're coming up to Pope Boniface, but not quite yet. There's another pope. So the cardinals, 9 of them now, have been meeting for almost 2 years, and they cannot get a 2/3 majority to elect the next pope. And then seemingly out of the blue, the dean, so the leader of the College of Cardinals, a man named Latino Malabranca, he mentions that he has just received an urgent letter from a holy hermit. And Benedict says, rather sarcastically, I suppose that's one of the letters and one of the prophecies from Peter of Morone. And sure enough, it was. This dean of the College of the Cardinals was something of a follower of Peter of Morone. Now, who was Peter? He was a mystic. He was an austere anchorite, meaning he lived by himself. He was a hermit. He had founded an order of monks after the Holy Ghost, he said. And so his followers called themselves, were known as spirituals. And he was a throwback to an earlier age, the sort of people we've seen before. He was reputed to work miracles. He lived an incredibly austere life. He was like the desert fathers of old. He lived up on a mountain, Morone Mountain, they called it, all by himself, had these ecstatic kinds of visions. And so Latino, the cardinal, mentions him. And all the rest of the cardinals start talking about this Peter. They've all heard of him. He's famous. And they talk about his stories, and some of them believe them, and some of them scoff at the stories about Peter of Morone. But then Malabranca, the dean, says, surprisingly, and in a loud voice, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, I elect Brother Peter of Morone." He was putting for an official vote this austere monk to be the next pope. And it's one of those ideas so crazy that it actually worked. See, he was not Colonna, he was not Orsini. So they thought, okay, all right, he's not either one of us. And here's what they thought, and this has happened before in the election of popes. They thought, you know what his chief virtue was? He was in his 80s. And they thought, well, he's not going to be around much longer. And so they elect him. Benedict, meanwhile, he's not a Colonna, he's not an Orsini. Benedict's very ambitious. Benedict wanted to be pope, but he's very shrewd. He goes, okay, now's not the time to put my name forward. This man's not going to live very long, and I'll just wait. So he votes, and unanimously they elect Peter of Morone, the next pope. Well, first, they had to go find him because he lived in the mountains over 150 miles away. And when the papal delegation eventually found him, to no one's surprise, Peter did not want to be the pope. We've seen this before, but he does not want to be the pope. One by one, the cardinals come and find him, and eventually they convinced him, for the sake of this spiritual vision that he has for the church and for renewal, he agrees to be the pope. He takes the name, how you want to say it, Celestine the Fifth. That's a V, not a 2. Celestine the Fifth. On August 29, he is crowned Bishop of Rome at a ceremony in the little town of Aquila, which would give its name to the famous Aquila Report, for those of you who like to follow Presbyterian gossip there. Not exactly a direct connection. Celestine's reign as pope was as short-lived as it was disastrous. This old man was pious, he was sincere, and he had absolutely no clue what he was doing. He had no idea how to run the administrative machinery or deal with sophisticated people, because this was not a church spiritual function for the most part. It was a diplomatic, political empire. He set up his court in Naples instead of Rome. He lived in a giant castle fortress. Okay, Pope, here you go. What's the first thing he did? His first act as Pope? Within this giant castle, he made for himself a little teeny prison cell where he could live, because that's the life he really wanted. He wanted to live like an ascetic monk. It didn't work. He was out of his depth, easily manipulated. He didn't speak Latin well. He handed out benefices to whoever wanted him. He passed out gifts and favors, and the cardinals whispered in his ear to get him to do what they wanted to do. People said, oh, you want it? You just gave them favors and things that they wanted. He didn't know how to do the machinery. He didn't know what to do. By this time, there are elaborate feasts, like state dinners that you're expected to partake in. And of course, he is used to an austere lifestyle. He did not like these feasts. The story is told that he wandered around the castle from room to room with all of these feasts, munching on a dry piece of bread. That's all he wanted to eat. He wanted to be back in his cave on Mount Meron. Well, it didn't take Celestine long to realize he made a terrible mistake. Part of what made it difficult is a lot of the common people were excited about this. In particular, his spirituals, the people, his followers, they thought, well, this could be a new age, a dawning of a new spiritual age in the life of the church. They were ecstatic that the founder of their order had been elected pope. But Celestine was inept. Remember, I said he was in Naples, not in Rome. One of the reasons he was at Naples, he was under the protection of the king of Naples. And Celestine did whatever the king told him to do, including one time he appointed one of the king's chosen subordinates as a cardinal just casually after dinner one night. Could you make this man a cardinal? Sure, you're a cardinal. He was out of his depth. Well, at some point in the midst of this debacle, Celestine started thinking about abdication. The Colonna would later claim that Benedict was like a worm tongue. They didn't say that, but like a worm tongue whispering in his ear, that may or may not have been the case, getting him to abdicate. But it's certainly true that Celestine leaned on Benedict. Benedict's expertise was in the law. And so if you want to abdicate from something as complicated as the papacy, you need lawyers to help you. And so Benedict helped him draw up all the official legal documents. Benedict, like a good lawyer, was the one who wrote the statement that he would publicly read when he abdicated the throne. He summoned the cardinals, and on December 13, not even 4 months after his coronation, he told the cardinals that he was done as pope, and he read the legal statement that Benedict Gaetani had written for him. And Celestine V didn't even last 4 months, and he was done. 10 days later, the College of Cardinals met again, and they moved much more quickly this time. It took them only 24 hours to elect a new pope. Benedict Gaetani. And he takes the name Pope Boniface VIII. Boniface was haughty, ambitious, ruthless, greedy, and vindictive. Unless you think this is just a Protestant reading on Gaetani, no, pretty much everyone, especially his many, many enemies, would agree with that assessment. He was hungry for gold and for land. He jealously guarded the authority of the Pope, and he quarreled with anyone who got in his way. Once, when the University of Paris, that's really the leading university on the continent, once when the University of Paris was interfering with papal business, Boniface said, quote, "You Paris masters at your desk seem to think the world should be ruled by your reasonings. I tell you that this is not so. It is to us that the world is entrusted, not to you." And so he warned in no uncertain terms, you mess with me, Rome can and will destroy you. What about Celestine? Well, he abdicated, but he's still alive. He was ordered to travel back with the papal party from Naples to Rome. He was utterly dismayed. What? No, this is why I resigned. I want to be as far away from this. I want to just be up on the mountain I'm in my 80s. I just want to live my austere life. But no, he was captured. You have to come back to Rome. He managed to escape with some of his followers. And when Boniface learned of his escape, and he learned that some people thought Boniface was a usurper, and that Boniface had tricked Celestine into abdicating. And sometimes in some cities where it was proclaimed that Boniface was the new pope, people booed. Boo, hiss, queen of the wicked. They did not like. Some of them wanted Celestine. So Boniface orders that Celestine be arrested and brought to Rome at once. Now in Rome, Boniface undergoes a magnificent papal coronation. First, there would be a consecration at St. Peter's Basilica, and then a processional to the Lateran palace. He was given a crown, or a tiara, a crown befitting an emperor, 48 rubies, 72 sapphires, 45 emeralds, 66 large pearls in his crown. It was declared upon his coronation, quote, "Take the tiara and know that thou art the father of princes and kings, the ruler of the world, the vicar on earth of our Savior Jesus Christ, whose honor and glory shall endure through all eternity." Quite a declaration. And then, as he processes from the basilica to the palace, kings from various principalities throughout Europe would be there as he was striding on a magnificent white horse. They would be walking beneath him through the slush and the cold. Unmistakable symbolism. These kings of Europe considered it an honor just to be in the lowly train of the Pope, just to be walking behind him as he was riding in on a white horse. He wore a belt from which hung 7 keys and 7 seals. Sounds kind of like Revelation. He rode through the streets tossing gold and silver coins. He even had the audacity to quote the line from Acts, "Silver and gold have I none, but what I have I give to you." Well, it's not my money, but he's tossing out money to the crowds. Once in the palace, he sat upon a marble seat. Palace officials kissed his feet. The Pope handed out gifts to various church officials. Meanwhile, Celestine, he had fled for Greece, but eventually he's caught when his followers proclaim him the true Pope. Just imagine him going, "Ixnay, do you speak Igpe Atenlay?" Just, "No, I'm not the Oppe." Well, they declare him to be the true Pope. And so he's caught and he's brought before Boniface and the King of Naples. Remember the King of Naples, he's one of the leaders, the high-ranking officials. The new Pope probably wanted Celestine to come and was expecting that he's going to give him some sort of blessing, some sort of passing of the torch, some sort of word. After all, he has him brought in chains, and he's there, and okay, you're going to say something nice about me. But instead, old Peter of Morone uttered a prophecy that later generations would marvel at and how accurate it proved to be. Quote, he says to Pope Boniface, "You have entered like a fox, you will reign like a lion, and you will die like a dog." Whew. Well, Celestine was condemned to live out the rest of his days imprisoned in the isolated fortress of Fumone. And one of the things when you're dealing with hermits is when you confine them to prison, they say, "Yay! This is what he always wanted. I get to be in a cell all by myself." Well, he didn't live much longer. He died 10 months later. The ignominious death of Celestine underscored an obvious and uncomfortable point at this time in the history of the church, and that is that spiritually minded, gospel-oriented popes were the exception, and popes who were hungry for land and money and titles and power were very much the rule. And no one fit this rule more perfectly than Boniface. He threw himself into 2 of the most common evils of the day for the Pope. Simony. Simony is the buying or selling for the Pope, the selling of church offices, named after Simon Magus in Acts, who wanted to try to buy the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So it's called simony. So he's just to the highest bidder. He's bringing in great wealth by selling off benefices, church offices. And the nepotism, well, that goes with it. He's giving these to his friends, his families, his uncles, his nephews, his cousins, to all of his family members to build up the Gaetani land and wealth. Boniface's worldliness, even for the low bar of the 13th and 14th century, was beyond the pale. His singular goal seemed to be the acquisition of new lands for himself and for his family. At times, this meant driving out people from their homes who had lived there for generations. Other times, it meant a kind of formal transfer of power. Remember, here in the Middle Ages, when I say, well, what does it mean when he takes over a town and the Gatanis want cities for their own? Well, it's a kind of fiefdom. So there are fiefs, and then there is a lord, and these fiefs these vassals, states, cities, have to pay a fee to their overlord. So it's a way of generating money. I'll give you some sort of protection, but if this land belongs to me and my family, and for you to live here, you have to pay us. So it was a way to gain land. It was a way to gain wealth. Boniface has two powerful enemies. One were the spirituals. So these are the followers of Peter of Morone. They're still loyal to Peter to Morone, Celestine, even though he dies. They have one fiery leader in particular, Jacopone de Tode. Jacopone. He lived an absolute dissolute life, and he had a dramatic conversion. He was a rake, he was a libertine, and then he has a dramatic conversion, and he becomes, instead of a fanatical sinner, he becomes this fanatical monk. And so he hated Boniface, and so did the rest of the spirituals. This man, Jacopone, railed against Boniface, quote, as an angel from the abyss. So that's one enemy. The other, come back to this family, the Colonna family. So they are powerful. They have men who serve as cardinals, and they had begrudgingly, remember, Benedict's not an Orsini, he's not the other rival family, but he's not a Colonna. They had begrudgingly gone along, okay, he kind of splits the difference, and they had begrudgingly gone along with his reign until everything changed May 3rd, 1297. Sometimes there are just days that you can point to in history and you say, that's where it turned. Well, what happened on May 3rd, 1297? It was late in the afternoon on a Thursday, and there was a caravan of mules that had a great quantity of gold. And they were passing by Rome, and this was money that Boniface was using to purchase more lands for himself and for the Gatanis. So this was Boniface's money, or it was probably tribute coming into him, but he considered it his money. Well, one of the Colonna, told you this does sound like kind of a mafia story, had other plans. This man was Stephen Colonna. He was a young man. He was a hothead, and he decided that he would swoop down with some raiders and he would steal this gold for himself, and that's just what he did. The Colonna were not eager to give in to Boniface, though Boniface heard about this, and immediately everyone kind of knew, this is the work of the Colonna, and this is Stephen. They all knew who did it. Well, he starts putting the pressure on the Colonna, but the Colonna say, well, wait a minute, your election was illegitimate anyways. We know that you forced the old godly man, Peter of Morone, to abdicate. And who's to say that this gold? So they say, let's just have a council and try to sort out this mess. We're not sure you're really a legal pope, and the rumor is that one of our family members did this, but let's have a council and try to figure it out. Well, the problem was the Colonna had many other enemies. And so, though people didn't like Pope Boniface, they didn't like the Colonna either. So they were eager, they were happy to come alongside Boniface as he fought against the Colonna, going after their rivals. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Boniface excommunicated and deposed two of the Colonna cardinals. So two of the cardinals were still from this family. Then he excommunicated everyone who was connected to the Colonna. And then he insisted that in every Colonna city, a papal garrison, So again, you got to think of the papacy as like a European power, like a European empire. And so they put papal garrisons in every Colonna town to sort of make sure that they don't misbehave. Well, there's no turning back now. The Colonna step up their war of words. They charge Boniface with forcing Celestine's abdication, which may have been true. And they charge Boniface with being a tyrant who only cared about lining his pockets with gold and strutting about, quote, as a god on earth. And that accusation was definitely true. But Boniface was just getting started. So excommunication had been used a lot. I mean, that's what the church did too often. You're excommunicated. Well, for rank and file people, that meant something. But if you're one of these leading Roman families and your real spiritual state is not very deep, you're not too intimidated about, oh no, the Pope, you hate this guy. Oh, he excommunicates me. But here's excommunication had legal ramifications. Once you were excommunicated, you did not have the same rights as other citizens. So now, if somebody comes and burns your house to the ground, well, you're sort of a non-person, you're persona non grata around here. You've been excommunicated. And to make it even clearer, Boniface specifically absolved everyone who attacked Colonna property. They're enemies of me, which makes them enemies of the church, which makes them enemies of Christ. And so if you just happen to wink, wink, nudge, nudge, go and take their stuff, well, it'll be fine. So people, I get to loot and pillage, and it's legally permissible. That's a good deal. A few months later, Boniface took an even more decisive step. He called for an official crusade. Now, the Crusades had started and were mainly about recovering the Holy Land, but now, by the end of the 13th century, the Pope realizes, hey, I got enemies here. He calls an official crusade against the Colonna family. Well, there's not a lot of people who get, yes, I'm going to leave my hearth and home to go fight against the Pope's enemies, but there's enough, like the Orsinis and other enemies of the Colonna. So they join in this crusade, not much of a holy crusade, and they take over every Colonna city. The Colonna are defeated. By the summer of 1298, there's just one Colonna city left. It's the ancient city of Palestrina. Now, there's a musician later by that name because he comes from this same city, actually the city that's rebuilt. We'll hear why it has to be rebuilt in just a moment. But this is the last city, and they're all sort of holed up in Palestrina. They know, and the Pope knows, that if you're in a well-fortified city and you have food and water, a siege can last a very long time. Well, eventually the Pope's going to win, but it's going to take a long time. It's going to be painful, and both sides seem to think, do we really want to go through this whole siege? And so Boniface comes with a negotiated peace. And he says, well, why don't we allow that if you surrender this city, I will allow your cardinals to come back, I will restore your possessions, and I won't destroy this city. Just you surrender, and I'll give some measure of honor and power back to the Colonna. Now, at this time in Palestrina, they're under the guardianship of John Scalona, who goes by the nickname, I'm telling you, it's a mob story, Sciarra, which means quarreler. He's an old warrior type, an old veteran, and he's the last one who's holding out the Colonna's stronghold in Palestrina. Well, they agree. This sounds good. And so they surrender, and for a time, it looks like both sides are getting what they want. The two cardinals, along with Stephen Colonna, are released. Now, Stephen Colonna is supposed to go throughout Europe and beg for everyone's forgiveness, but at least he's released, and the cardinals are released. And so the Colonna cardinal, Stephen Colonna, this man Sciarra, they fall at the Pope's feet, And in ritual obeisance, they beg him for mercy, and they feel like this is, okay, we're doing our bit, you're going to let us go, you're going to leave, you're going to restore some power, and we're going to have kind of a cooling off period, and then we'll figure this out. It seemed like a win for the Colonna, except during this presumed cooling off period, Boniface gives the word completely against the promises he has made and says, I want you to go and level Palestrina anyways. And they do it. His garrisons level the city, kill 6,000 residents. It was an act of wanton treachery. This was considered one of the great cities of the Roman world, one of the 7 ancient cities of the Roman Empire. Since the earliest days, there had been a bishop in Palestrina. Often in the earlier days of the empire, because you got sort of cool sea breezes, it was maybe 20 miles away from Rome. Wealthy noblemen, emperors, Augustus had a home in Palestrina. There was a palace that it was said Julius Caesar built. There's a shrine to the Virgin Mary. He wouldn't dare destroy Palestrina. Well, he does, right to the ground, saves only a cathedral. And to make matters worse, often when you would destroy a city, you didn't really destroy the whole city. What you would do is you'd knock down part of the wall so that their defenses are broken. You'd knock down a tower or two. You get the point. We won, you lost. Why do you need to knock down everything? That takes a lot of time. You can't just drop bombs. You got to have people with rams and horses and axes. It's a lot of work to destroy a bunch of stone buildings by hand. But Boniface says, no, you go do it. Every single building in there. And he resurrects this old Roman order where he actually literally salted the earth. You know that expression? We're plowing up the fields so you can't plant anything, and you salt the earth, meaning we're going to make sure, because salt takes out the nutrients and the water in the soil. You can't plant. This city is destroyed. Well, the Colonna have nowhere to go. This man, Sciarra, wanders about. He's captured by pirates until the King of France, Philip IV, finds him. He purchases his freedom. I can't remember, this may have 1 R or 2, but purchases his freedom and says, okay, Sciarra, you come with me. I may have something for you to do yet. Hold your thought there. So it's 1300. Pope Boniface is at the height of his power. In this long struggle between Pope and Emperor, clearly the Pope has come out on top. In fact, one time, when rival claimants to the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of Germany, West Central Europe, come to Boniface and say, could you settle which one of us is the emperor of here? And he said, emperor? I am the emperor. What are you coming to me to settle your dispute? I am the emperor. As far as Boniface was concerned, he was a new Caesar, a new Augustus, the most important person in the most important empire in the world. And in 1300, and this has a connection here to Reformation Sunday, in 1300, he proclaims the very first holy year, a year of Jubilee. You do a pilgrimage, and you purchase a plenary indulgence, and you can set your soul free from purgatory. You can purchase the absolution of your sins. You just have to come to Rome, and you have to purchase an indulgence. Well, this is a smashing success for Rome and for Benedict. It fills his coffers even more, this year of Jubilee. It was a commercial success, but you always want more money. And so Boniface, I erased him up here, but he's important, is having this conflict with Philip IV of France and Edward I of England. They're fighting with each other. Philip and Edward want to raise money because England and France, well, they're often fighting against each other. And how do you raise money? Well, if we could only tax the clergy, because all of the church lands are tax-free. Quite a good idea, I think. But they want to try to tax the church lands. Well, in the Pope's mind, He's not so much thinking, well, you can absolutely not tax the clergy. He's just thinking, well, only I can tax the clergy. No, you can't tax the clergy. Philip persisted that he had the authority to tax Boniface's church. And so Boniface has a papal bull called Clericos Laicos, where he pronounces a sentence of excommunication on anyone who imposes taxes, anyone who exacts revenue from the church, anyone who so much as takes a possession from the church. And the universities are often instigating these measures, and they're put under interdict, which often happens in the Middle Ages. Interdict means your whole city here or your university, you don't get the Mass, you don't get the sacraments, you don't get any of the church ministry. So the secular authorities were to be deposed. This deeply offended Philip IV of France, who said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cut off all French contributions. All right, we're not sending no more money from French churches to you, our rotten Pope. And this leads to one of the most famous or infamous papal bulls called Unum Sanctum. Why is it called a bull? A bulla is a Latin word for a wax seal that would go on the document. So in an official document, there's a bulla, so these were called bulls, having nothing to do with our word for cows. And the papal bulls are so named because of the first two words. So whatever the first two words are in the papal bull. So this one is Unum Sanctum, one holy, because this is about the one holy Catholic Church. Unum Sanctum in 1302 represents the farthest reach that the Pope has ever claimed for the Church. The papal bull acknowledged two swords. All right, there's two swords. There's the spiritual sword that the Church is given, and there's the physical sword that the state is given. Okay, that sounds reasonable. But the Pope says, now, but some of you misunderstand it. So when Jesus told Peter to put his sword back, yes, it's true, the church per se doesn't have the power of the sword, but the fact that that command came from Jesus means that the secular sword is always at the beck and call of the church. So you unsheath your sword when the church tells you to. So, okay, there's two swords, but the kings and captains wield their sword, quote, at the will and permission of the priest. Unum Sanctum claimed for the Pope again that prophecy of Jeremiah, I have this day set thee over nations and kingdoms. And whoever resists us resists God. So here's the climax, quote, furthermore, we declare, state, define, and pronounce, all right, serious. You're declaring, stating, defining, pronouncing that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. Every human creature on the earth is subject to, you may have your kingdom of Naples, you may have your kingdom of France, your kingdom of England, but every creature on earth is subject, doesn't say Christ, to the Pope. Well, Philip responded by having one of his monks issue a refutation of Boniface. The Pope then excommunicates Philip. Philip calls an assembly. He files 29 accusations against the Pope. He says the Pope is guilty of infidelity, simony, sodomy, idolatry, murder. He lost the Holy Land. The Pope, of course, denies all these charges, but it's too late because there is a well-funded plan in the works. And on the morning of September 6, 1303, while Pope Benedict Gaetani is in his ancestral home of Anagni, that ancient city where he has his lands and estates and home palace. He's there sleeping in his bed. A large group of armed men enter the Pope's family estate. Philip had hired 2,000 mercenaries, and they joined with locals. And who is the man that Philip has tapped to lead the attack? Oh, the Italians never forget. It's this man, good old Sciarra Colonna. I may have a job for you, my friend. And so he's there, and when they finally break into the family estate, Pope Boniface, defiant to the end as he can hear them coming, he puts on all of his royal robes, puts on his magnificent crown, sits on his throne just waiting for them in all of his regal attire as they enter in. They order him to abdicate, and he says, I would rather die. And soon he will. He's put in prison for 3 days, and then he's released. He's returned to Rome after the mercenaries had been driven out, but the Pope never recovers from this outrage, from this humiliation, and he dies 1 month later on October 11, 1303. The rumor spread, probably the Colonna started it, that he died by suicide, that he was gnawing off his arm, and he died by banging his head in frustration against a wall. But it doesn't seem that was the case. He died from natural causes and probably died from despair. Upon his death, Boniface was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in a magnificent tomb that he had designed for himself. So how do we assess the reign, not even 10 years, of Pope Boniface? Well, I mentioned last week Dante. Dante Alighieri, hope you've all had to read at some point in a literature class or Western Civ, something from the Divine Comedy. It's not really all that funny, but that's just the technical name. As Dante is led through hell, purgatory, and finally paradise. Dante's Divine Comedy is published in 1321, but it's set in 1300, right there in the middle of the reign of Pope Boniface. Dante, you need to know something of his history. He was on the wrong side of a political conflict in Italy. Boniface had some of his rivals brought before him on trumped-up charges, and Dante was on the wrong side, and so Dante was convicted of crimes he didn't commit, and the penalty was to be burned alive. Dante, fortunately for world history and literature, was not in Rome at the time. He was traveling, but that travel then became a forced exile. So he wasn't burned, but he couldn't go back. He was in exile for the rest of his life, and he traveled through various courts in Italy for the remaining 19 years of his life. He had little in the way of money, connections, or reputation. And he was a sincere, serious Christian, Dante was. So Dante had personal, political, and religious reasons to abhor. I mean, he hated Boniface. Now, interestingly, even though Dante often talks negatively about Boniface in the Divine Comedy, he talks about this incident where the Colonna come and break into his home, and that was even a bridge too far for Dante. He said, okay, he may have been absolutely wicked, and he may be in hell, but he was still the vicar of Christ on earth. And so he has a respect for the church even in that incident. In Dante's work, he has 3 popes from his own time in hell, pretty daring. Some, as I mentioned last week at the service, upside down, with their feet out of the earth, torched by fire, and their head enclosed in a bag of money. It was to symbolize that the 8th circle of hell is where he put people who are guilty of simony, who bought and sold church offices. And so he puts 3 current popes there. He drags Boniface through all 3 books, from hell to purgatory to paradise, because there he has Boniface stand before St. Peter. And St. Peter, this is in Canto 27 of Paradiso, St. Peter's face turns red. He's so furious when he sees Boniface. And here's what St. Peter says, Dante, "The usurper of the throne given to me, there on the earth, that now before the Son of God stands vacant, he has made a sewer of my sepulchre, a flow of blood and stink at which the treacherous one who fell from here may chuckle there below." So Dante has St. Peter in no uncertain terms say, you have made my office a stink and a sewer, and you can laugh the rest of your life there in hell. After Boniface's death, Philip IV instigates an official investigation. It's called Against the Memory of Pope Boniface. And historians today still debate that this lasts several years. It's an official investigation. Now, you're dead, so you don't have any way to defend yourself. And Pope Boniface had a lot of enemies. So they're able to bring people who give very salacious reports. And it's hard to know. They sound so salacious, it's hard to even believe that that Boniface said them. But maybe he did, we don't know. But these are the sorts of things that people alleged they heard Boniface say. For example, they testified that he made quips that the dead would rise as much as his little horse would rise from the dead. That Mary was a virgin as much as his own mother was a virgin when he was born. Or, this is maybe worst of all, supposedly he said that sex with women or boys is as much a sin as rubbing your hands together to wash them before a meal. Did he say those things? Well, he's dead, and you have a lot of people who hate his guts. So historians don't know, but it says something about him that many people could come forward and were willing, whether it was true, exaggerated, or made up, to make these allegations. In the end, they never reached a verdict. So there was no final verdict on the memory of Pope Boniface. Well, here we bring it to a close. You might think, well, after Boniface dies in 1303, perhaps things will get better, but they didn't. After Boniface and his conflict with Philip, and he dies, the cardinals reach a backroom deal to elect a Frenchman who takes the name Clement V. And during his reign, 1305 to 1314, he resides in Avignon. And this, in 1309, starts the time of history of the Avignon papacy, sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the church, because there is no pope in Rome. This is the time where the French are the most powerful, not really a nation, but the most powerful people in Europe, and so the pope becomes a kind of toady of the French. And beginning in 1309 to 1376, in the Avignon papacy, all these French popes, who basically are just instruments of the French crown to do what the French monarchs want them to do. By 1377, finally, Pope Gregory IX returns to Rome, in part because of the insistence of a popular nun and mystic named Catherine of Siena. If we had more weeks, I'd do a lesson on Catherine of Siena. So, the end of the Babylonian captivity. The Pope has returned to Rome. Not so fast. The church was quickly torn apart by rival claimants to the papal throne. So then you have a pope in Avignon, then you have a pope in Rome, and that starts a period from 1378 until 1417 called the Great Western Schism, where you have two different popes. Councils get involved and try to settle it, but you know what happens? Eventually the councils split. And sometimes you have two councils, one pope, two. You cannot decide. This Great Western Schism. Well, the Great Western Schism finally ends with the Council of Constance in 1417. And at that council, which met over several years, which ended the schism, 2 years earlier in 1415, that Council of Constance condemned an English academic from Oxford who is long dead, you know his name, John Wycliffe, in order that his bones be exhumed and be burned. He was already dead, and they also at that Council of Constance condemned a man from Prague named Jan Hus. And that is your teaser to come back next week for the last week of the Middle Ages. See you in a few moments.